Was Jesus married to Mary Magdalene? Did he have children? Does his lineage live on today? This is what the Da Vinci Code claims, that the church has tried to conceal the greatest secret in all of history. But in this video, we'll analyze each argument presented in the movie from a neutral perspective. What's true? What's fiction? Be warned, this story isn't for everyone. At the Louvre Museum, Jacques Saunière runs for his life. Behind him, Silas, a monk obsessed with burying a forbidden truth, forces him at gunpoint to speak. Saunière has no choice. The answer lies in the sacristy of the Church of Saint Sulpice, beneath the line of the rose. What he seeks is buried there. Once Silas gets what he wants, he shoots. Saunière fears he hasn't completed his mission. With his last ounce of strength, he moves through the museum, making a final attempt to preserve the secret and reach the only people who can help. Meanwhile, Robert Langdon, a Harvard professor of religious symbology, is signing copies of his new book. French police interrupt and show him a photo, Saunière's body. Perhaps he can help them decipher it. Langdon looks at the image and shudders. Who could have done something like this? But the police correct him. No one did it to him. He did it to himself. Silas reports. They're all dead, and they all confirmed the same thing before dying. It's under the rose, in Saint Sulpice. Silas undresses and kneels before the crucifix. He tightens the cilice, a chain with spikes embedded in his skin. It's his way of purifying himself through pain and sacrifice, as Jesus did. He makes the sign of the cross, takes a whip, and lashes his own back. Silas isn't the only one who practices such acts. Many people still engage in mortification. We'll see more about that later. In the meantime, Langdon is escorted to the museum, where Captain Fash awaits. They pass the iconic glass pyramid and enter the Louvre. Langdon's eyes go straight to it. A glass structure suspended from the ceiling. Just below, there's a smaller stone pyramid, creating the illusion that the two almost touch. Excited, Robert mentions their geometric echoes. Fash couldn't care less. They lead him to Saunière's body. Langdon feels a knot in his stomach. Meanwhile, on his private plane, Bishop Aringarosa is being coached by a media expert. He needs to be ready to handle tough questions. The Catholic Church is undoubtedly one of the most powerful and successful institutions in history. Since its beginnings in the 1st century, it has established itself not only spiritually, but also culturally, politically, and economically on a global scale. It has its own state, the Vatican, complete with its own bank managing around €5 billion and an enormous real estate portfolio. Over 5,000 properties, including churches, buildings, land, and commercial spaces, valued at approximately €883 million. But its power isn't just in money, it's in its political influence. From the Middle Ages to the present, the Church has advised world leaders, supported or challenged governments, and participated in international negotiations. It also exerts significant influence over the daily lives of billions of people. The Pope, bishops, and priests serve as moral guides for many and have shaped customs, social norms, and even laws. At its core, the Church seeks the well-being of humanity. Many of us have witnessed its aid to the sick, migrants, orphans, and people in poverty, as well as the comfort and support it provides to millions worldwide. But, like any powerful institution, it also sparks curiosity. What happens behind the scenes? Do its leaders truly uphold the values they preach? With such power, controversies, abuses, and conspiracy theories are almost inevitable. The expert asks for his opinion on Opus Dei, the Catholic organization he belongs to. Some call it a manipulative cult, others, an ultra-conservative Christian sect. Aringarosa responds that they're simply strict Catholics. They don't pick and choose which rules to follow or ignore, they adhere to doctrine to the letter. Opus Dei is one of the most controversial organizations within the Catholic Church. As Aringarosa puts it, they are deeply traditionalist, especially on issues like carnal morality and the role of women. Moreover, some members still practice corporal mortification, which involves inflicting physical discomfort or pain on the body to strengthen the spirit, control passions, and unite with Jesus' suffering. Some celibate Opus Dei members use a cilice, a small chain with spikes that presses into the skin for 2 hours a day, and once a week, they self-flagellate their backs with a small corded whip while reciting prayers. Though these practices aren't mandatory, they are recommended. In fact, Saint Josemaria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei, saw mortification as a key means to achieve holiness and strengthen spiritual life. In his book The Way, he wrote, "If you're not mortified, you'll never be a soul of prayer." Of course, he wasn't only talking about chiliches or whips. For Josemaria, mortification also included small daily sacrifices, like renouncing certain pleasures or enduring discomfort with patience. But physical mortification was indeed part of his spiritual vision. His phone rings. It's the teacher, informing him that Silas has fulfilled the deal and that it's about to close. Aringarosa smiles. That night, he'll meet the council and ensure the teacher receives his money. Langdon examines Saunière's body and recognizes the reference, the Vitruvian Man, one of Da Vinci's most famous drawings. But there's a star on his chest. Fash insists it's a satanic symbol, but Langdon argues it doesn't have to be. The star can also represent Venus, the feminine half of all things. Fash doesn't seem convinced. He shows Langdon the message Saunier left in invisible ink, a series of numbers and a strange phrase, Diabol Indrakon LMA La Asno. Suddenly, a woman bursts into the room. It's Sophie, a police cryptologist. She's already decoded the numbers. They're the Fibonacci sequence, but jumbled. Langdon checks and nods. She's right. Sophie hands him a paper with a number. He must call. It's urgent. Langdon dials and hears Sophie's voice in a recording. Professor Langdon, don't react. You're in danger. Don't reveal anything to Captain Fash. At St. Sulpice, a nun receives a call. A bishop has requested a private tour. She checks the clock. It's the middle of the night. Something feels off, but she has no choice. Langdon asks Fash to use the bathroom. There, Sophie waits and reveals the truth. They didn't bring him for his expertise. They intend to frame him. She shows him a paper with Saunier's full message. Fash erased a line before Langdon arrived. P.S. Find Robert Langdon. Fash is certain this means Robert is the killer, but Sophie explains that P.S. doesn't mean postscript. It stands for Princess Sophie, the nickname her grandfather, Saunier, gave her as a child. It wasn't a message for the police. It was for her. Saunier wanted her to find Langdon, but they have no time. They need to escape. They find a tracker the police planted on him. They toss it out the window to throw them off. As the agents follow the signal outside the museum, Langdon and Sophie return to Saunier's body. They study the message again. The numbers are jumbled, so what if the letters are too? It's an anagram. Langdon rearranges the letters and figures it out. Leonardo da Vinci, Mona Lisa. They head to the portrait. Above the painting, another message in invisible ink. So dark the con of man. Langdon feels a chill. Could it be true? He analyzes the message and spots a pattern. Rocks, Virgin of the Rocks, another Da Vinci painting. They move it and find a key with a fleur-de-lis. Robert grows increasingly frightened. The police realize their ruse and begin the chase, but they manage to escape. Sophie examines the key and recognizes it. Her grandfather had one just like it. Langdon is stunned and asks, "Have you ever heard those words, so dark the con of man? As a child, did you witness anything? Secret meetings, something ritualistic, like the Priory of Chaon?" A hazy memory surfaces in Sophie, but she suppresses it, telling herself it must have been her imagination. Langdon explains that the Priory of Chaon is an ancient myth, said to be one of history's most secretive and powerful societies. Among its members were Isaac Newton, Leonardo da Vinci, and many others. Its symbol is the fleur-de-lis, and its mission is to protect a secret known as the Dark Con of Man, a secret said to hold the true source of God's power on earth. In reality, there's no evidence the Priory of Chaon ever existed. Rather, in 1956, a Frenchman named Pierre Plantard created a series of documents called the Dossier Secrets, which supposedly proved the Priory of Chaon was a secret society operating since the Middle Ages. He included lists of historical members like Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli, and Isaac Newton to lend credibility. Then, he deposited them in the National Library of France, hoping historians would take them seriously. The fraud went unnoticed for years until it was uncovered by three men, L. Bain and Lincoln, who became fascinated by the story. They began investigating the alleged Priory of Chaon, searching for connections to other historical events. They found vague documents and references that seemed to support the existence of secret societies and speculated that the Catholic Church was interested in covering its tracks. They published the book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, arguing that the Priory's history had been deliberately erased and that a conspiracy hid its true purpose. Years later, Dan Brown, the author of the novel The Da Vinci Code, read this book and assumed everything in it must be true, inspiring the plot of his novel and movie. But if it was all a fabrication, why do they have such convincing evidence? Could there be some truth behind the myth? Silas enters the church of St. Sulpice. The nun guides him and explains that the line of the rose is a mark on the floor indicating the old Paris meridian. Across the city, 135 markers trace its path, some running through the church. Silas listens in silence. He knows what he must do. St. Sulpice is a real church in Paris, and inside, a brass line is embedded in the floor, known as the gnomon of St. Sulpice, used to measure the sun's position. Essentially, it functions as a solar clock. At noon, light enters through an opening in the wall and projects a point onto the line. Over the year, that point of light shifts, allowing key dates like the equinoxes and solstices to be marked. This enabled precise calculations for when Easter and other religious festivals began. In reality, the line of the rose doesn't exist. It's an invention based on the gnomon of St. Sulpice. Silas suggests the nun leave. She understands immediately, rushes to make a call. Silas breaks the floor and destroys the line of the rose. Beneath the stones, an inscription, Job 38 verse 11. It was a trap. Langdon and Sophie remain in hiding. The police need a plan. Sophie recalls the riddles and treasure hunts her grandfather used to give her as a child. They always ended with the same question. What's the next step? Langdon explains to Sophie that the Priory of Chaon has existed for over 1,000 years and was behind some historical events, including the Crusades in the Middle Ages. A French king organized a crusade to conquer Jerusalem, but the idea wasn't his. Behind it was the Priory of Chaon and its military arm, the Knights Templar. Their true mission was to find a relic lost since Jesus' time, something deemed essential to the church. One day, they succeeded, brought their find to Rome, and showed it to the Pope. In exchange for his silence, the Vatican granted them unprecedented power. Over time, the Templars grew too powerful, becoming a threat, and the Vatican decided to eliminate them. The Pope declared them heretics and ordered their execution. Papal troops were sent to recover the sacred artifact, but they never found it. Thus began the search for the lost relic. The Knights Templar did exist during the Middle Ages. Thousands of Christians from across Europe traveled to Jerusalem and other holy cities on pilgrimage, but the roads were dangerous. Bandits, wars, and conflicts between kingdoms and religions meant many were robbed or killed before reaching their destination. To protect these pilgrims, the Order of the Temple, better known as the Knights Templar, was founded. The Catholic Church granted them special privileges. They paid no taxes, answered only to the Pope, and received donations from kings and nobles supporting their mission. Over time, their role expanded beyond protecting pilgrims. They became the bankers of European nobility, managing fortunes, lands, and assets, which made them incredibly powerful and wealthy. But in 1307, King Philip IV of France had a problem. He was in debt to the Templars and couldn't repay them. Seeking an excuse to eliminate them and seize their wealth, he accused them of heresy, blasphemy, and secret practices. Under torture, some Templars confessed to crimes they likely never committed, giving the king the justification he needed to convince the Pope that the order should be dissolved. Thus, in 1312, the Templars were officially disbanded, and their assets were confiscated. However, while the Knights Templar did exist, their founding had no connection to finding a sacred relic, much less to the Priory of Chaon, which, as we've seen, never existed. Sophie says she's never heard of this relic, but Langdon assures her she has. She just knows it by another name, the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is one of history's most famous and mysterious relics. It's said to be the chalice Jesus used at the Last Supper and in which Joseph of Arimathea collected his blood after the crucifixion. But in reality, the Bible nowhere mentions a special chalice or anyone preserving Christ's blood in a cup. In fact, the first mention of the Grail wasn't in a religious text, but in a work of fantasy. In 1190, the writer Chrétien de Troyes referenced the Grail in a story, but it wasn't a chalice and had nothing to do with Jesus. It was a magical plate that could heal diseases and provide infinite food to its possessor. Years later, another writer, Robert de Boron, took the idea and gave it a Christian twist. In his version, the Grail was the chalice from the Last Supper and the sacred object where Joseph of Arimathea stored Christ's blood. It no longer provided infinite food but granted divine grace, spiritual enlightenment, and even eternal life, but only to those deemed worthy. From there, the legend grew. The Grail evolved from a fantasy object to a sacred symbol, and over time, many stories linked it to the Church, the Templars, and conspiracy theories. So, did Saunier know where the Holy Grail was? Or perhaps something even greater? They examined the key with the fleur-de-lis. It's for a safety deposit box. Meanwhile, at St. Sulpice, the nun dials Saunier's number. The others on the list are dead. The lie has been exposed. The rose is broken. She pleads for help, but it's too late. Silas is there. He recites the words of Job 38 verse 11. Thus far you shall come, but no farther. He demands to know where the key is, but the nun stays silent. Silas lifts the stone and strikes her, leaving her lifeless. He kneels beside her and prays for her soul. Aringarosa meets with the Council of Shadows. He requests 20 million euros to hand over to the teacher, the man secretly helping them destroy the Holy Grail and protect the faith. Langdon and Sophie arrive at the private bank. The key they found opens a safety deposit box. Inside, they find a small box carved with a rose, the symbol of the Holy Grail. The police are on their way, but they manage to escape. Sophie opens the box. Inside is a cryptex, a device designed by Da Vinci to safeguard secrets. The information is written on a papyrus scroll wrapped around a vial of vinegar. If anyone tries to force it open, the vial breaks, and the vinegar dissolves the papyrus, destroying the message forever. The only way to open it is by aligning the 5 discs with the correct word. The cryptex wasn't created by Leonardo da Vinci. It was actually an invention by Dan Brown for his novel. However, the idea that da Vinci might have designed something like it isn't entirely far-fetched. He was passionate about engineering and left hundreds of sketches of machines, gears, and even advanced locks. He's also said to have had a fascination with riddles and hidden messages. There are several reasons behind this notion. For one, he was left-handed and wrote backward, from right to left. Some believe he did this to hide his ideas, but in reality, anyone with a mirror could read it. Most likely, he simply wrote that way for convenience, not to conceal anything. Another reason is the belief that some of his works, like Mona Lisa or The Last Supper, are filled with secret messages and hidden symbolism. In truth, Most of these theories are modern exaggerations. Yes, Da Vinci was a master of detail and used symbolism in his paintings, but no more than other artists of his time. There's no evidence he had encrypted messages in his works. Moreover, as a genius ahead of his era, theories abound linking him to secret knowledge or occult societies, but there's no proof of any of that. The closest he came was his membership in the Brotherhood of San Lucas, a guild of artists akin to a union. Over time, however, the image of Da Vinci as a mystic and genius shrouded in secrets has become more a pop culture myth than historical fact. He was simply an artist and scientist, not an esoteric prophet. Sophie smiles. She remembers when, as a child, her grandfather made her a cryptex. Langdon takes a deep breath. It can't be a coincidence. He tells Sophie, "What if your grandfather was preparing you for the priory?" Sophie doesn't want to hear it, but to Langdon, it's clear. He gave her riddles, cryptexes. They decide to seek answers from Lee, an expert on the Holy Grail. He explains that the priory's members are scattered across the world with a single mission, to protect the greatest secret of modern history. But unlike what many believe, that secret isn't the source of God's power on earth. It's the source of the Church's power. Sophie doesn't understand how a chalice could hold such power. Lee explains that the Holy Grail isn't a cup. It never was. To prove it, he takes them to the Last Supper, Da Vinci's famous painting. According to tradition, in that scene, Jesus shared a chalice with his disciples, the moment that gave rise to the Holy Grail. But if you look closely, something's odd. There's no chalice. If the Grail were truly a cup, why didn't Da Vinci include it in the scene? The answer lies in the interpretation of the Grail. Though it became associated with a cup over time, the term Grail could also refer to something entirely different. To understand this, we need to look at the symbols. In many traditions, a triangle pointing upward represents the masculine, the phallus, virility, the sword, power. Its opposite, a downward pointing triangle, symbolizes the feminine, something that receives, contains, protects. It's the shape of a chalice, but also a womb. That's the true meaning of the Holy Grail. It was never a wine cup, but a symbol of a woman. And she's present in the painting. Sophie looks at him skeptically. Everyone in the painting is male. But Lee urges her to observe the figure to Jesus right more closely. It's not John. It has delicate features, feminine hands, a subtle hint of a bust. It's Mary Magdalene, Jesus' wife. Lee points out another detail. Jesus and Mary wear complementary colors, reflecting each other like a mirror. Moreover, their bodies create an empty space between them shaped like a chalice. Leonardo was pointing to what history concealed. Plus, if you move Mary to Jesus' other side, her posture aligns perfectly with his, as if she were leaning on his shoulder, like his partner. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. Starting with, why isn't there a prominent chalice in Da Vinci's Last Supper? In many earlier paintings, Jesus is depicted with a chalice at the center, but Da Vinci broke with that tradition, placing several wine glasses scattered across the table. This could be due to 3 reasons. First, because he loved to innovate. He didn't like simply copying what existed. He always sought new ways to depict scenes. Removing the chalice was likely just one of many creative decisions to distinguish his work from previous versions. Second, the focus of his painting isn't the moment Jesus turns the bread and wine into his body and blood, but when he announces his betrayal. That's why he emphasizes the disciples' reactions over the chalice. This shift in focus was another creative choice to break tradition and make his work unique. Third, because the Bible doesn't mention a special chalice, it only says Jesus shared wine with his disciples. The idea of a sacred chalice stems more from artistic tradition than the biblical account. As for the triangles, in Da Vinci's time and culture, they weren't used as symbols of masculine and feminine. Their meaning was more tied to the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The downward pointing triangle, or chalice, represented the Eucharist, not femininity or a womb. Though in some cultures triangles have come to symbolize the masculine and feminine, there's no evidence Leonardo was exposed to that symbolism. So, if there's a triangular space between Jesus and John, or Mary Magdalene, in his painting, it's most likely a compositional choice, not a hidden message. Now, about John's figure. It does appear more feminine than the others, but that doesn't mean it's a female figure. John was the youngest apostle, and in that era, it was common for artists to depict young men with soft features, smooth skin, and no beard, not because they were feminine, but as a symbol of innocence. This wasn't unique to Da Vinci. In earlier works by Andrea del Castagno and Giotto, John also appears with a more delicate look. It was an artistic convention, not a secret message. The same goes for the colors of their robes. Da Vinci chose them to balance the composition and guide the viewer's eye to Jesus, the true focal point of the scene. And what about John leaning on Jesus? Well, in most depictions of the Last Supper, John is shown resting on Jesus' chest, as he was considered his favorite disciple. That was the convention of the time. But Da Vinci, wanting to break tradition, separated them to make Jesus the absolute center of the scene. As a genius, he found a way to balance tradition with his own style. That's why, if you reflect John's figure, his posture fits perfectly with Jesus, as in many earlier versions. Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code, took real historical elements but removed them from context and distorted them to craft a plot that, while intriguing, doesn't seem historically sound. It feels convincing because it uses real data, but when analyzed in its proper context, many of his theories collapse on their own. The Last Supper is undoubtedly one of history's great works, but it hides no secret messages or codes. Sophie remains unconvinced. Just because Da Vinci painted it doesn't make it true. But Lee has more evidence. The Gospel of Philip, one of the texts rejected by the church, mentions that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' companion and the disciple he loved most. Sophie counters that companion doesn't mean wife, but Langdon explains that in those days, the term was sometimes used to refer to a spouse. This isn't entirely accurate. It's more of a forced interpretation. The term companion or koinonos could also mean partner, collaborator, or someone who shares in a common endeavor. Bart Ehrman, a biblical studies expert who isn't religious and has no interest in defending any faith, states that the Bible never mentions Mary Magdalene as Jesus' wife. In fact, her name itself suggests she wasn't married to him. She's called Mary Magdalene because she was from Magdala, a town in Galilee. In that culture, women were typically identified by their husband or son. For example, Mary, mother of Jesus, or Mary, wife of Cleopas. If Mary Magdalene had been Jesus' wife, it would make sense to call her Mary, wife of Jesus, rather than identifying her by her place of origin. Lee adds that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene says Jesus considered her his favorite and, instead of Peter, entrusted her with continuing his church. This is a misrepresentation of the text. The Gospel never states that Jesus gave Mary Magdalene leadership of his church over Peter. What it does mention is a conversation where Jesus imparts certain revelations to Mary Magdalene that he didn't share with the others. When Peter learns of this, he grows upset and questions why Jesus would trust something so important to a woman instead of them. This scene isn't about who should lead the church, but about the role of women in the early Christian community. Should they have a voice and authority in transmitting Jesus' message or not? This makes more sense considering the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was written between 100 and 200 years after Jesus' death, meaning it wasn't penned by eyewitnesses, but by communities that reinterpreted his message over time. Thus, rather than recounting Jesus' life, these texts reflect the debates of their era about the church's structure. Given they were written long afterward, they're more likely to reflect late interpretations than historical facts. Even in these Gospels, there's no mention of Jesus and Mary Magdalene being married. In the Gospel of Mary, she appears as a close disciple, but at no point is a marriage between them suggested. Lee offers his final piece of evidence. The term Holy Grail comes from the French saying real, meaning royal blood. So it's not about a chalice, but Jesus' lineage. This is incorrect. A linguist would be appalled to hear it. The term Holy Grail derives from the medieval Latin sanctum gradale, meaning plate or vessel. Meanwhile, royal blood in Latin would be sanguis regalis. Sanctum gradale and sanguis regalis are entirely different terms. Though their French translations sound similar, their etymological origins are unrelated. So, Lee asserts, Mary Magdalene was pregnant with Jesus' child. To protect herself, she fled Jerusalem for France, where she gave birth to a girl named Sarah. This is the greatest cover-up in human history. The secret the Priory of Chaon has guarded for 20 centuries. They don't protect a relic but the descendants of Jesus and the existence of his living heirs. After analyzing the supposed evidence, there's no historical basis to support any of these claims. What seems more likely is that these are conspiracy theories built from isolated historical facts, taken out of context and twisted. Lee turns on the news. He had no idea Langdon and Sophie were being hunted and no longer wants to get involved. But Langdon reveals something that changes everything. Sophie is Saunier's granddaughter, and Saunier was preparing her to receive the Priory's secrets. Teabing stands by her side. Saunier, the Priory's grandmaster. But there's more. Langdon places the rose box on the table. Lee gazes at it with fascination, but when he opens it, there's only a cryptex. That means they need the code. Sophie probably has it. Lee interrogates her. Did your grandfather teach you any codes, Priory songs, riddles, symbols? Sophie's mind races. Her whole world is shifting. Silas bursts in and attacks. Langdon manages to subdue him, but the police are already surrounding the property. Fashion and his men are outside. Remy, Teabing's butler, helps them escape in the trunk, with Silas gagged. On the way, Sophie asks if the church is trying to kill them. Teabing explains it's not the church as an institution, but an elite group within it, the Council of Shadows. It's a handful of members hidden in key positions who have devoted their lives to erasing any evidence of Jesus' lineage, fearing that if the world learned the truth, people would lose their faith, and with it, the church's power. Teabing arranges his private plane, and they flee France. Meanwhile, Aringarosa secures the money from the council to deliver to the teacher, the mastermind behind the plan to destroy all evidence of Jesus' descendants. Mid-flight, Teabing tries to crack the cryptex. Sophie asks, what happened to Mary Magdalene's body? He tells her the Priory protected her sarcophagus and hid it so no one could desecrate it. The cryptex's code might reveal the exact location of her secret tomb. Langdon takes the rose box. Something catches his eye. He slides a pin under the rose, and a panel falls. The letters are written right to left, as Da Vinci used to write. With a mirror, they read the message. In London lies a knight. A pope interred him. His labor, the wrath of holy men has stirred. The orb that in his tomb should stay will speak of flesh and womb. A knight whose funeral was attended by a pope, with an orb in his tomb. They think of the church where the Knights Templar were buried, Temple Church in London. When they arrive, they search for the knight's tomb, but none have the orb mentioned in the clue. Silas breaks free, demanding Langdon hand over the cryptex or he'll kill Sophie. Remy, Teabing's butler, pulls a gun, aims at Silas, then suddenly turns it on Langdon. He's an infiltrator, working for the Council of Shadows. Silas and Remy, working together, take the cryptex and Teabing. Remy thanks Silas for all he's done and reveals the truth. He is the teacher. Silas wants to keep helping, but the teacher tells him his role in this mission is over. He leaves Silas at the Opus Dei house. However, Remy was lying. He's not the teacher, just an employee hiding his identity. He meets the real teacher, assures him Silas suspects nothing, receives his payment, and promises to stay silent. They toast. Remy drinks and collapses seconds later. He's been poisoned. The teacher watches without emotion. He's the one who's been manipulating everything from the start. He calls the police, informing them that Saunier's killers are at the Opus Dei house. Meanwhile, Langdon keeps analyzing the clues. The knight whose funeral was attended by a pope. But something doesn't add up. He translates it to English. A pope, Alexander Pope. Finally, it clicks. Alexander Pope attended Isaac Newton's funeral. They head to Newton's tomb, which features an impressive sculpture with orbs. Jupiter, Saturn, the moon. Which of those orbs has 5 letters? That's the key to opening the cryptex. Suddenly, Teabing appears. He couldn't solve the cryptex. He just needs the Grand Master's granddaughter's help. He points a gun at her and demands the code. He wants to expose the truth about Jesus, deliver historical justice, unmask the lie, and free humanity from the church's manipulation. Meanwhile, the police raid the Opus Dei house. Silas panics, pulls his gun, and flees, firing at the officers until he accidentally shoots a Ringarosa. Silas freezes, and when he doesn't stop, the police shoot and kill him. Fash pieces it together. Langdon and Sophie aren't the killers. It points to a Ringarosa and someone else. Back at Newton's tomb, Teabing keeps demanding the code. Sophie tries to remember, but her mind is blank. Langdon tries to decipher it, analyzing the clues. Newton's tomb, the orbs. Suddenly, he has an idea. His eyes light up. He writes a word on the cryptex, but it doesn't work. He knows what he must do. In a swift move, he tosses the cryptex into the air. Teabing lunges to catch it, giving Sophie a chance to escape his gun's reach. The cryptex hits the ground and shatters. The vinegar spills. The only key to finding Mary Magdalene's sarcophagus is lost forever. Just then, the police burst in, but they're not after Langdon or Sophie. They're after Teabing. He's arrested. Langdon approaches Sophie and confesses what he's realized. Newton angered the church with his work, and it all began with a single orb, the apple. That was the cryptex's key. He figured it out before destroying it. He pulled the map out first. Now they have the final clue. The Holy Grail awaits beneath the ancient Rosslyn. The chalice and sword guarding its gates rest by the art of masters, adorned, cloaked by the starry vault. Langdon believes he knows where it is. Rosslyn Chapel, a chapel built by the Knights Templar, located on the line of the Rose. When they arrive, Sophie realizes she's been there before as a child. She used to visit the place. At the entrance to a subterranean passage, they see a symbol with 2 triangles, one pointing down, representing the chalice, the feminine, the other pointing up, representing the sword, the masculine. Together, they symbolize the union of man and woman. It has to be there. A church worker watches them suspiciously and makes a call. They find a room with a starry ceiling, remove the rug, and uncover a small door with a fleur-de-lis. They descend and reach a chamber with a rose at its center. That's where Mary Magdalene's sarcophagus once lay. That's where the Holy Grail rested. But it's gone. What happened? Did the church find it? They inspect the area and discover ancient documents, some dating back to Jesus' time, records of his lineage. Langdon flips through the writings, unable to believe his eyes. He asks Sophie, "Do you have memories of your grandfather before the accident, before your parents died?" Sophie looks at him, confused. She doesn't know how to answer. Langdon shows her a newspaper clipping with the names of those killed in the accident. Her mother, her father, her brother, and one more, hers. It says Sophie died in the accident. And her surname isn't Saunier. It's St. Clair, from one of France's oldest families, a royal bloodline. She is a descendant of Jesus. Perhaps her family's accident wasn't an accident. Maybe it was the church's attempt to eliminate her. But the priory learned she survived and decided to hide her. They placed her under Saunier's care, the Grand Master, who raised her as his own. All this time, Saunier had told her without her realizing it. Princess Sophie. Saunier didn't just want Sophie to protect the Grail's secret. She is the Grail. They exit the passage and find people waiting for them, but they're not enemies. They're Priory members, Saunier's allies, there to protect her. A woman approaches and hugs her. It's her grandmother. To keep her safe, she had to leave her in others' hands, but now she finally welcomes her home. Robert asks Sophie, "What will you do now? Will you reveal your identity to the world?" Sophie doesn't know. She asks, "What would you do?" Robert tells her that, in the end, the only thing that matters is what each person chooses to believe. Perhaps Jesus was just a man, but his message was so powerful it transcended his humanity. Maybe the human can be divine. The only thing that truly matters is what each person chooses to believe. They part with a hug, and Robert returns to his hotel. As he shaves, a drop of blood falls into the sink and traces a straight line. He thinks of the line of the rose, the line of blood. He knows the key is there. He follows the markers tracing the line of the rose across Paris. The path leads him to the Louvre, to the pyramid. He reads the clue again. The Holy Grail awaits beneath the ancient Rosslyn. The chalice and sword guarding its gates rest by the art of masters, adorned, cloaked by the starry vault. And then it all clicks. All this time, the answer was there, beneath the inverted pyramid. There lies Mary Magdalene's sarcophagus, history's best-kept secret. Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code, wrote at the beginning of his book, "All descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate." When asked in an interview about the historical background's veracity, he replied, "Absolutely everything." And many believed him. Surveys showed a significant portion of readers thought the story was real, fueling distrust toward the Catholic Church. This is a clear example of how disinformation works. It takes real data, removes it from context, mixes it with fiction, and presents it convincingly. Many people, without pausing to analyze it, accept it as truth. So, in an era where information spreads without filters and opinions are shared as absolute truths, questioning what we consume is no longer an option. It's a necessity. If we don't, we risk being manipulated, believing lies that can harm us.